Right, so welcome everyone to this session on project planning, monitoring, and evaluation. Uh, because of some technical difficulties, we would have liked people to be able to ask questions straight, but because not everyone can be in the channel, the best way to do it will be through the chat channel, and Neil will be looking through the questions and reading them out at the discussion points. So before we start, I would like to welcome and introduce David. David Hollow, he's the team leader at Jigsaw Consult. He's been working in international development for 10 years, for more than 10 years, and he did his PhD from Royal Holloway, University of London. His PhD was focused on evaluating the impact of ICT on education in Africa. So let's move to slide 2, just a cartoon here which highlights the need to articulate our goals and impact in a clear and systematic way. I just came across this and I thought it was quite funny and interesting, but here it's highlighting the need in relation to funders. I think impact assessment is a lot broader than that, not just limited to funding and funders. What I would say the overall goal of our impact assessment program is to make open knowledge a more robust and grounded learning organization that can demonstrate and communicate its successes and impact well, both internally and externally. So the purpose of the session today would be to introduce some basic M&E methodology approaches and tools, and also to provide the thinking behind it, the hows and the whys, and such things. And it has been highlighted through the feedback we got that one of the main blockers to doing impact assessment or evaluations on projects throughout the organization would be time and limited time and resources. So what we'll be focusing on is lightweight templates and options that can be used or adapted to different conditions. The other purpose of the session, I would say, is to provide opportunities to clear doubts and highlight the key concerns or blockers and what you would like more resources and tools around. So there'll be opportunities to share ideas and feedback through the chat channel and discussion points that will be there. Just type it in and we will take it up. And I would like to do this week after the workshop a feedback form where you will get to input more. It's very important for me to personally to understand on the specific requirements on project levels, so I can build tools and provide assistance in those things that can help us evaluate our programs and projects better. Moving to slide 3. So that's the basic agenda. We'll be going through the M&E tools, which can be used for project planning, management, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. I've chosen the LogFrame and theory of change, which are two industry-wide standards most commonly used. There are many templates that exist for this. I'll be introducing 2 of the most straightforward ones I could find. But I also want to talk about the thinking behind this, because that's what, at the very least, should be integrated into project planning and delivery. I've made a lightweight template for using that, which I'll be also sharing. M&E data collection methods will be next, and their strengths and weaknesses, and I'll be touching on the importance of mixed methods in impact assessment. We'll be speaking about most significant change, which is the IA approach that I found very useful, that David introduced me to, and we'll be speaking about building a solid evidence base and things like impact stories and case studies, how we can collect this more systematically. There will be a chance to do a question and answers with session with David Hollow at the end. If you have any questions, put it into the chat and we can read it all out, and he can share his knowledge and on those things. Slide 4. So I would like to start first of all with an important base of M&E SEC, logic models. So what is a logic model? A logic model is a project planning, monitoring, and evaluation framework that helps to increase understanding of a project's goals and objectives and defines the relationships between factors key to implementation and articulates the internal and external elements that could affect the project's success. It acts as a roadmap that helps us not only to be more targeted from the outside, keeping the goal in mind, but also to build a bridge between our day-to-day work and bigger change we would like to see in the world. It is a very useful way of bringing together existing evidence about an initiative and clarifying where there is an agreement or disagreement about how the project is understood to work and where there are gaps in evidence. So, slide 5. Here I've tried to put together a diagram which gives you the basic elements broken down for a logic model. We have spoken about inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and goal before, but here it shows you, if you look at the arrows, that divided into resources and result, and normally planning happens starting with thinking about the goals and working downwards for what we need, and implementation happens the other way around. This is the basic concept used for logic models. There's different diagrams that can be used to represent the logic model. By logic model examples, I would say LogFrame and theory of change. Sometimes they're shown in a series of boxes, breaking down these elements. Sometimes they're shown in a table. Sometimes they're shown as a series of results with activities occurring alongside them rather than just at the start. I'm flexible with this. I think it depends on project needs and what people want, what's the best way for them to communicate as a group, to stakeholders, etc. So I'm not fixed on which way it is done, but the key elements must be there and the thinking process behind it must be there. Slide 6. A well thought out logic model can assist greatly with thinking through programmatic strategies, objectives, planned activities, whether they are indeed the most appropriate ones to implement. Many existing tools can be adapted to specific contexts, as I mentioned, and the monitoring and evaluation needs. I would stress that if these kind of monitoring and evaluation activities and tools are considered and built into programmatic work from the start, the resource and time burden is minimized. I can give examples of why this would be the case later on, if this requires clarification. So why should we use a LogFrame? Basic points I've listed there, so just to go through them. It's mainly to organize our thinking, be more focused in communication, achieve stakeholder consensus, to think through how activities and investment will lead to the expected results, be able to set performance indicators so we can track if we are moving towards that goal, to also allocate responsibilities clearly, especially for monitoring and evaluation. There's a lot of data collection that needs to be streamlined properly to use resources properly, and there needs to be clear indication where that is going to come from and who's going to look over that and see that it's being collected in the proper way. Because M&E, I would say, is not a one-person job. It should be throughout the project team, throughout the organization. Then it works best, because then the learning shared makes sense to everyone. So it is advisable to involve all relevant stakeholders in at least decisions about goals, objectives, and activities of the project to get buy-in to any evaluation that will be conducted. Their discussion should also bring out any assumptions they have about the project and the risks they see associated with the project, which is a key important thing in order to mitigate these things as they come up. So slide 7. Here I have, there's a link. If you click on it, there's a template that I have put together with David last year. This template guides you through questions in order to fill up the matrix that you see over there. This is generally what I use. There's different variations of it, but I find this very useful. And if you look at the arrows, it recommends that you start from the goal and work downwards. So you work backwards to link outcomes to the goal, and then outputs to outcomes, activities to outputs, and so forth. However, this is useful when log frames are being created at an early stage of project planning and activities are not yet defined or in motion. There can be a number of different entry points to working on a log frame depending upon which stage the project is in. Whatever the case is, all the questions need to be answered, all the sections need to be filled in for clarity. Here I usually put in an extra column that not everyone might put in, but I find it very useful with the problem statement to define what the problem that the project is set up to solve along with the goal. For each of the inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and goal, corresponding columns need to be filled up in the narrative column, indicators, means of verification, and assumptions and risks. A column on who is responsible for each bit can also be included. I'll be going through this in a bit more detail in a couple of slides. Let's move to slide 8. So the log frame structure is based on cause and effect concept. By definition, each project described by the log frame is based on this then or cause and effect logic. After filling in the different sections in the first round, I would always go back to verify the vertical logic with the if-then test. So this diagram sort of gives you an understanding of that each thing should link in a logical sense when you filled it in. If this happens, then the next level should happen, logically speaking. So for example, at the lowest level of the log frame, we should be able to see that if certain activities are carried out, you can expect certain outputs to result. There should be the same logical relationship between outputs and objectives and between objectives and the goal. There's also another column which you can see with assumptions. Assumptions are the statements about the uncertainty factors which may affect the link between each level. These may be external factors which cannot be controlled in the project, or those which we choose not to be in control of or be held accountable for. Assumptions also describe the conditions which are needed to support the cause and effect link between each level. By definition, the project team is not responsible for such assumptions. These are outside their control. The team is responsible for producing defined outputs and sometimes the outcomes. We can determine the assumptions by asking what conditions must exist in addition to my objective at each of those levels, activity, output, objectives, or goal levels, in order to achieve the next level. How will each stage be achieved and why is it important? So moving to slide 9. Here I have, when we worked last year with School of Data, we produced a log frame. There is, in a way, no such thing as a perfect log frame, and you'll see on the first round we only did what was necessary for us to do. Some of the columns are not filled in, but it gives you a good idea of how of a familiar program and how we have filled it in. There's also at the bottom a link to types of indicators. Let me just talk you through indicators a little bit. A lot of you might already know quite a bit about indicators. So what is an indicator? An indicator is designed to demonstrate results. It's a performance measure that tells us how to recognize successful accomplishment of a level. These measures, direct or indirect, will verify to what extent objectives have been fulfilled. So indicators can be of two types, numerical and non-numerical, and that link will show you like some examples of those and explain what each of them are. There's a table there. I would say it's often better to have fewer indicators and use only the number of indicators required to clarify what must be accomplished to satisfy the objectives stated in the narrative summary column. The rule is the indicator you choose for measuring your objectives must be verifiable by some means, hence the name of objectively verifiable indicator, OVI. If they are not, you must find another way. The last column, means of verification, these are statements to specify the source of information or data for the measurements or verification specified in the indicators column. It may be helpful to first think of all possible means that may be useful to collect this necessary data. I'll be going through later how you can collect data, the different methods, things like focus group interviews, surveys, and so on. It is recommended to use a mix of qualitative and quantitative data for M&E purposes to negate weaknesses inherent in either of them. So at this point, we have gone through log frames. I know I'm moving a little bit fast because we lost time. But I'll pause for a second. If anyone has any questions, to clear doubts of what I just spoke about, there'll be a chance to discuss things later. Then maybe I'll take it up to clear those doubts. Okay, so there's no questions in the chat, Neil says, so we can move on, I guess. Just have to share my presentation again, sorry. So the next thing we would like to share. So the next thing I would like to speak about is the theory of change. Many of you might already be familiar with the theory of change. Here I have given a link to a straightforward template with guided steps. It was introduced to me by Lucy, who was heading School of Data last year, for those of you who might not know. I find this very useful because it's a very good entry point into a theory of change, which can be quite complicated. It uses the same concepts as a LogFrame, quite similar concepts. It's laid out in the same with the same concepts that are introduced for logic model, but laid out in kind of a different way, more diagrammatic usually has better causal links in a LogFrame and includes things like key audience and things like that. Below, you'll find another link which shows you a worked example from School of Data, which hasn't, both of the LogFrame and this may not have been updated for some time, but I think it still is quite useful to have a look at how it was represented last year. Lucy also wrote a very nice article explaining theory of change and talking about this template quite recently. So I'd like to share kind of her thinking behind it, which she quoted in that article to give a better understanding. So she says, creating a full theory of change is a much bigger piece of work than simply filling in a template. A theory of change should start from an organizational strategy and include all of the activities you're hoping to engage in before moving down to projects level. At the same time, I've seen so many organizations be overwhelmed by having to produce a full theory of change straight up. Worst case scenario, this leads them to not producing one at all. This DIY toolkit template I consider an accessible compromise to getting started with theories of change. So I would really ask people to have a look at this when you have time. Maybe try to put your project in there and see how it goes. Try to communicate with it. It would be a good starting point. Moving to slide 11. So slide 11, here I've tried to take out the kind of concepts that we have been speaking about and put it into 9 separate questions that can help you think through the goals and things that is going to lead you to that goal at the project planning stage. I think at the very least this should be thought through for goal setting and to understand these kind of steps. And also the key assumptions and considerations that you need to take into achieve success for the project. So this is meant to be slightly more conceptual and lightweight, but I think it can be quite useful too. So that's it for logic models. I'll be moving to the next section after this. There's a chance for slide 12. Any thoughts and questions? Happy to deal with that now. And I'd also like to mention that everything I'm speaking through, if something's not clear, you will always have, and if you think you want to work further on these things, I'm always available through the consultation hours that I defined earlier, which is Tuesday 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. British time, and Thursday it's same time. And informally as well, just send me a message on Slack or email. I'm happy to deal with that. So just looking at questions. Okay, question from Moore. Sorry, isn't theory of change represent long-term and not short-term goals? Uh, I would say it represents both, as it breaks down the steps to it, but definitely long-term goals are part of that. The template I've introduced also talks about the middle steps and what we need to achieve to get to that. Does that answer your question more? Great, so no more questions. Let's move to the next slide, slide 13. So let's talk a bit about data collection methods. So after you've laid all these things out in whichever form suits your project, it's important to think about how you're going to collect data. I was asked yesterday this question that if there's no time and resources and we decide that we want to do an evaluation at the end, why do we need to consider this early on? It's because a lot of the data can be collected through the program or the project itself. If it's designed well, you won't have to look at 5 different spreadsheets at the end to do the evaluation. It could save a lot of time and resources if thought through well before, even if you're going to do an evaluation at the end. So data collection methods, I've tried to break this into 4 different categories: information from individuals, info from groups, direct observation, and existing documents and data. There's some examples below that. There's a lot more examples I could list, but not all of them are useful, especially in a setting where we are a remote organization, etc. So I've tried to focus on the ones I find most useful in my day-to-day work when I have to do evaluations and things like that. So the first one I would like to speak about is interviews. There's various kinds of interviews, as you'd know. Like you could do it over, a video call, or you could have face-to-face. You could have questions sent through emails, and each of them will have different advantages and disadvantages. But generally speaking, interviews give you the opportunity to ask detailed questions, and you can probe a lot further and provide a lot richer data. Non-verbal data for face-to-face interview can also be collected through observation. Complex and unknown issues can be explored, and response rates are usually a lot higher than self-administered questionnaires. On the downside, it can be quite expensive and time-consuming, although telephone and web interviews are cheaper. Also, there needs to be a certain skill level for the interviewer to avoid bias and things like that, and to be able to dig deeper. For surveys, surveys are a really good way of gathering large amount of data, providing a broad perspective, and can be administered electronically, by telephone, by mail, or face-to-face. Mail and electronically administered surveys have a wide reach and are relatively cheap to administer. Information is standardized and privacy can be maintained. On the downside, they can have a lower response rate and are unable to investigate issues at a great depth. They require a target group that is literate and do not allow for any direct observation. Also, as surveys are self-reported by participants, there's a possibility that responses may be biased. So within the survey, there's various ways you could ask questions. There's closed questions, open-ended, and scaled questions, multiple choice questions. Each of these can serve a different purpose. Closed questions are usually in the format of yes, no, true, false. Open-ended questions, on the other hand, leave the answer entirely up to the respondent, and therefore provide a greater range of responses. Skills are also useful when assessing things like participant attitudes or skill changes. So there's very many ways to do it. These are all things I'm happy to, if somebody wants to do a feedback form or wants to design something, I'm happy to work with them on it. So this is just introducing it on a very basic level. So moving to slide 14. So one thing that I was introduced to by David that I found very useful as a concept, more than using it on a formal level, was the MSC technique, the most significant change approach. So formally, the MSC technique is a participatory M&E approach without the need for indicators, and usually involves many stakeholders in identifying and selecting the most significant stories of change uh, from the field level. This sets out usually to first identify cases of significant and critical changes. These can be both positive and negative, relating to key objectives rather than looking for trends related to a certain phenomenon. MSC can be very helpful in explaining how change comes about and when, in what situations and contexts. So slide 15. Uh, so the basic steps of this kind of approach is deciding the types of stories that should be collected, collecting the stories and determining which are most significant, and then sharing those stories and discussing uh, the values with stakeholders and contributors, so it can facilitate learnings in a better way. And there can be a shared understanding about what is valued for the project or the program. From an M&E perspective, this method can help track stories of change related to less quantifiable issues, such as capacity building and skill changes, attitude changes, things like that. Broadly, as a concept, it can be used to investigate the human side of stories, which I feel is very, very important because that touches people in different ways. You can have a lot of records, a lot of data, which internally you mark to show success or impact. But to the community and such things, it's a story of change, and things like impact stories or impact case studies, and I would differentiate stories from case studies in the sense that stories are more an individual story or individual story of change in a certain context. A case study would be showing that change with various sources, with multiple sources showing the same change. So this approach and concept can be put into things like interviews or open-ended questions in surveys, even in focus groups and other participatory approaches. So the concept is quite useful. I have more information on this. Happy to share it in digest forms for use. A question which I'll just take up after this. Moving to the slide 16. Just to wrap up on what I've been speaking about. So to me, the most effective nonprofits use data, whether it is systematically collected from internal sources or rigorous evaluations, for ongoing learning, self-evaluation, and improvement, and communicate this broadly so that everyone's sort of on the same page, has the goal and vision in mind. Evidence of a program's impact can range from, like I mentioned, anecdotal stories to data collected ad hoc or systematically to evaluations of various sophistication. Amassing evidence and advancing evaluation systematically should be ongoing and a dynamic process that will enable us as an organization to continually improve both our programs and projects, and to replicate and expand it where successful. So one of the major things that I would like to discuss, whether now or later, is how we can systematically collect stories, how we can chase these up. I have time to follow up stories, not always, but there are gaps where I have time, and I would love to follow those up. But if you can systematically collect sources and needs, and just kind of the basic why we are following a story, then it will be easy to follow those up. I can also make time to help with assessing projects, as I mentioned. So that's basically all from me for now, and time for thoughts and questions. So I'll go back to Rufus's question from before. Let me just close the presentation. So the question that I got is, Rufus, a general question. We missed a little bit back. I would love to see some of the examples of how things go wrong if you do not do this, or conversely, what benefits you get. How does it focus one, etc. Could I get some clarity on where this question was asked? What are we referring to? Just impact assessment in general, evaluations? in Slack overnight. So let me just follow up in Slack. Oh, LogFrame theory of change. So yeah, so, sorry about that, Rufus. So basically, what I'm trying to say is not. I'm happy to share that and put that together and share it why it's important. But so you're asking the question about why we should do a LogFrame or theory of change. So I would emphasize that I wasn't trying to say that we must do a LogFrame or theory change, although those are standardized ways of communicating in the industry. I was trying to say the thinking needs to be put together, and we might be already doing this on projects. The thinking of what the goal is, what the steps will lead to it, what the risk associated with the project is, and doing it in a standardized way will mean anyone looking at the project will quickly get on the same page. So if it's done in various documents or done in an informal meeting, if somebody new or a stakeholder has come in, we have to re-explain that in a narrative way. So the reasons for doing this, or even if you don't do it formally, running through those questions and being able to articulate that sort of thinking, I think it's vitally important in order to have clarity that, and have goal in the focus rather than just on the activities and kind of losing sight of the goal. Does this sort of answer the question for now? Yeah, so Rufus is also asking that do we have specific examples from open knowledge? No, I'm speaking generally at the moment. For certain projects, if it's already being done, that's great, but I don't think we do it systematically throughout the organization, and we don't have kind of a general approach that we use to that as far as I know. It might be done differently throughout, but it'd be good to collaboratively share those thoughts so that we can all sort of head on the same page. There's tools and methodologies we can use in order to do that. That'll be kind of my understanding on it. Yes, we have a strategy. That is absolutely true, but the strategy should be linked to the M&E plan. And so far, M&E has been done on a slightly abstract way because we started off. So the idea would be to think about that, what is the priority to evaluate, why we want to evaluate, how we lead up to these things, which all ties into the LogFrame after you lay out those things in a systematic way. Then it becomes easy to see where there's gaps in evidence, where theory is working and where it's not. So it's only the starting point to lay out those things. The strategy is definitely very, very helpful for that. Am I missing any of the questions, Neil? So if there's no more questions, I'd like to hand over to David so he can say a few words, maybe even speak about what we, like Rufus's question, and explain certain things, and it's just his views, and people can go on asking questions, and he'll be able to answer them. So I'll put myself on mute now.
Hi there, everybody. Thanks very much, Raoul. I hope everybody can hear me okay. First of all, just wanted to commend Raoul for that presentation. I thought it was a thorough, comprehensive review of the basic tools and methodologies and priorities within all of this. I think the first thing to say, just 1 minute of observations and then a couple of responses to the questions. With an organisation like OPF, you've obviously gone on a significant and exciting journey over the last decade and grown significantly, and there is sometimes some catching up work to do in terms of how you can integrate the learning and accountability strategy within all that's going on. ultimately monitoring evaluation is about that combination of learning and accountability, knowing why we do what we do and how we can do it better, and learning how we can articulate the value of that to the people who are asking us, be that the beneficiary of programs or external donors, both of those being very, very significant and very different. I think one of the reasons we find this to be so significant across all the organisations we work with is because when you're working within a program which is part of an overall organisational strategy, it's very easy to see the benefits of what you're doing as being self-evident. And when you're so ingrained in what you're doing, the benefits often are self-evident. But to an external donor who happens to be reading a funding proposal with not much time, those benefits won't be self-evident. And as Raoul communicated, because of the, as he said, industry standards of the log frames of the theory of change, when you're presenting funding proposals to donors, especially as they are becoming more substantial and sustained, the need for them to be demonstrated in those conventional ways increases. And it's work, but it's not too difficult to actually link that to your pre-existing strategy. The next observation is around the importance of the theory of change in relation to Rufus's question. The challenge comes in, I think, aggregating the data. If you want to get really into theory of change, one can choose to articulate the whole organisational strategy through a theory of change at a high level, which documents everything that you're doing. There's no reason why you'd necessarily choose to do that, but some organisations do. But what we're talking about is more at the programme level, how you can demonstrate that causal chain from the beginning to the end at the programme level. One of the things that we've found, and I think through my conversations with Raoul, would be particularly beneficial in implementing that in a standardized way across your programs, is that then you'd be able to aggregate up in a much more effective way. That means whenever any organization, any external funder asks you to provide evidence across the board of why what you do has an impact, you actually have a standardized mechanism that you can draw up that data rather than trying to pick around in different projects and give illustrations in a rather ad hoc way. So we find that to be particularly beneficial in terms of demonstrating the evidence base for those who aren't considering it to be so self-evident. I think I should. I could talk for a long time, but I'd like to know what you're most interested in. One final comment on the methodologies is
David.
that, yes.
There is a question that I put into the chat, if you want to pick that up.
Yes. Once a project has been evaluated, impact assessed, how is that information used to improve project development at an organisational level? Absolutely, that's totally fundamental to the whole thing. I think 10 years ago, evaluation and impact assessment was something which was often a bolt-on to an organisation. It would be a few people on the side, not really contributing to the overall direction of the organisation, but everyone knew it was kind of something you had to have somewhere. Now the trend is to recognise that the learning function within a team has to be situated right at the centre in order to influence the culture of where the organisation is going. There's nothing more infuriating than running an evaluation, be that internally with your team or through external consultants, to then have that put on a shelf and no one listened to it. So I think there's a few different elements to that, and that needs to be ensured by the way the project is evaluated in the setup, so that the questions that are being asked are the questions that are actually relevant to the future, so that the actual aspects of the project development can be focused on. But it's primarily down to the organisation in question, making sure that the recommendations are practical and applied rather than theoretical and abstract, and can then actually be systematically integrated into the future of what you do. That's a big question about how the whole organisation works, but if you're going to go further down this route of centralizing the role of evidence building and justifying what you do and demonstrating value for money in the midst of significant complexity, then you're going to have to make sure that learning is right at the middle. Otherwise, you get into a cycle where you don't manage to capture the learning in the evaluations, and then you realize 3 years later you're doing the same things. So it complicated process of knowledge management, but you need to systematize it within the core of what you're doing so that the actual project team who are implementing are reflecting back on the learning. That it's a pretty complicated area. I hope that's a summary. The one final thing I would say on that is that evaluation used to be confined to the end of the program. Now, far more constructive way of viewing it. More innovative organisations recognise the importance of regular touch points like midpoint evaluations and trying to integrate the learning into the actual design of the implementation. So a more iterative design process merges pretty well with a broader evaluation strategy. Conscious we touched on a few different things there. Hopefully that's helpful, but we can talk in more depth if that's useful.
Just checking for questions, David.
Sure.
Yeah, just we're waiting. Someone's typing, so. Okay, we got one more question. I'm just going to read that out. So, can you give any tips about how to address qualitative measures with stakeholders who may be used to or prefer quantitative, thinking about early stage project discussions?
Sorry, Raoul, could you say that one more time?
Sure. Well, I'll just copy paste it so you can have the exact question. Here we go.
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's a really good point and a common challenge. We often find that stakeholders want things that can be easily measured, things that you can attach percentages to and you can track change before and after without too much of a problem. The challenge with that is that the things that are most important to measure are the things that are hardest to measure on the whole. You've probably heard the phrase no stories without statistics and no statistics without stories. That's just emphasised the importance of mixed methods. So in terms of engaging with stakeholders who want to have solely quantitative tools, I think it's about going on a journey with them. Sometimes you're in a position where you can actually say, here is the methodology, and you can make sure that within that there are some observation sessions, some focus group discussions, or some interviews, or some story collection incorporated within that. I think most simply, the way to do it if people are not convinced is just to give a confident, clear articulation of the proposed methodology from the outset and make sure that that is mixed methods. There's also a very well established research base for the way in which mixed methods evaluations lead to more robust findings than either solely qualitative or solely quantitative. So I think I would give a confident methodology and also explain that this is situated within wider research. And then I also think if you have the relationship to actually start to question the stakeholders and take them on a learning journey with you as well, because the reason people often prefer quantitative is because that's what they've always been accustomed to, and I think if you can show them actually donors aren't just interested in solely quantitative data, and actually your project isn't going to benefit from solely quantitative data, then if they can start to see the actual practical outworking of the most significant change stories, like Raoul mentioned, the actual valuable data you can get where you dig into the open questions about what changes happen in people's lives and communities as a result of this intervention. So much richer than just statistics, although obviously you need those as well. And so those three things would be initial suggestions. Well, I think you went on mute.
Yeah, I don't see any more questions. So I'm just waiting one. So there's a thank you from Naomi who asked the question.
Thanks, man.
All right, so we are also over time, so maybe we call an end to this session. Thank you very much, David, and everyone for joining us. I'll be sending out a post-workshop evaluation form in the next few days. If you can all fill it in and give me input, not just on the workshop, but generally, now that we have introduced concepts, how do you think that applies to you? What else is needed? Things like that would be most useful. Thank you, everyone. So come to the end of the session. Thank you, David. Bye.
Thanks very much.